Dillian Whyte claims deluded Joyce has no defense and no power. As you can see from this interview that Dillian Whyte did on Sky Sports, he said he was terrible. He's got no defense and no power. He's got a good engine and a decent boxing brain, but he leads with his head. Anyone who's a clever fighter will clip him because his head and his chin are up. Throw a big overhand right or a left hook and you'll do him. If Joyce got in the ring with me, I would destroy him. Just like David Haye, Joyce is very deluded. That's why they get on so well. He's 32. He turned pro late. He's making noise to get some big fights. Why did he stay amateur for so long? Why did he stay amateur for so long? Because he wasn't good enough. He waited for the good amateurs like Anthony Joshua to go through. He just wasn't good enough. He also goes on to talk about Chisora here. He says, he sends me a message saying, when I see you, I'll slap you. So when I saw him, as he's had a lot to say on the internet, I told him, let's go backstage and speak about it man to man, face to face. He ran behind the security, shouting and screaming, making lots of noise. He wants publicity when there's cameras around, but when you get him face to face, he's got nothing to say. All right, those are the words of Dillian Whyte. You know, it's typical Dillian Whyte. He's a very aggressive, confrontational type of character. As far as what he said here about Joyce, is he interested in fighting Joyce? That would be my question, because why come out and say these things about Joyce if you're not interested in fighting him? Maybe Joyce has said something about Dillian Whyte. You know, maybe Joyce has said something which has angered or annoyed Dillian Whyte, and that's why he's responded in this way. Or maybe he just doesn't understand why the fans were cheering for Joyce, and so, you know, that's making him feel a bit territorial. Whatever the case may be, if Dillian Whyte was to actually fight Joyce at this point, I mean, I wouldn't mind seeing the fight, but it would surprise me. Doesn't Dillian Whyte have business advisors? Isn't Eddie Hearn advising him? And here's what I mean by this, right? Joyce recently called out Big Baby Miller, and Big Baby Miller quickly shut it down. He turned it down. And somebody in my Facebook boxing group asked me my opinion on, they called it Big Baby Miller ducking Joyce. And my response was, Big Baby Miller is a top 10 ranked heavyweight contender who is very close to a world title shot. Joyce is a 4-0 novice. Big Baby Miller would be absolutely insane to risk his position in the rankings when he's on the verge of a title shot by fighting a 4-0 novice who's good, you know, very good compared to most 4-0 novices. Big Baby Miller would be insane. So yes, I'd like to see the fight, but from a business point of view, it would be madness for Big Baby Miller to do that. And the same goes for Dillian Whyte. Dillian Whyte is on the brink of becoming mandatory challenger in 2 different sanctioning bodies. He's got an eliminator for the WBC against Luis Ortiz, and he's also got an eliminator for the IBF against Kubrat Pulev on the table. If he was to forego any of those fights to take on Joyce, that might be the worst career move he's ever made. I want to give you guys an example, which I may have cited before in the past, but when Lennox Lewis was an up-and-coming heavyweight prospect / contender, he won the European heavyweight title in something like his 12th or 13th fight from a Frenchman called Jean Chanet. And he was causing a stir on the British heavyweight scene because he was obviously an Olympic gold medalist, although he won the Olympic gold for Canada. But he turned professional and was basing himself in the UK. So he was causing a stir because the two biggest names in British heavyweight boxing at the time were Frank Bruno and Gary Mason, who was Frank Bruno's sparring partner for a lot of, Frank Bruno's career. And Lennox Lewis was snapping at their heels. Gary Mason at the time was in a similar position to Dillian Whyte or Jarrell Miller. Gary Mason was a 35-0, undefeated, top 10 ranked heavyweight contender on the brink of a title shot. Lennox Lewis was a 14-0 European champion who'd been mainly fighting at domestic level in the UK. But because Gary Mason felt so territorial and his ego and, machismo kicked in, he agreed to fight this 14-0 prospect, Lennox Lewis, when Mason was on the brink of a title shot. That was the worst mistake that Gary Mason ever made in his career. And RIP Gary Mason, by the way. He was a very tough man, a good fighter, good chin, punching power, determined, etc. A lot of heart. Died in very sad circumstances. He got hit by a car when he was riding a bicycle. Very sad what happened to him. He's a great pundit as well, Gary Mason, by the way. Great pundit. I actually miss him as a pundit and a commentator, but still, getting back to the story, fighting Lennox Lewis was the worst mistake Gary Mason ever made in his career. Not only because of the fact that he lost the fight, but also because Gary Mason, a couple of fights prior to fighting Lennox Lewis, had suffered a detached retina against a guy called Everett Martin. And he briefly retired, but I think he had surgery or treatment or whatever on the retina. And then he came back. He got cleared to box again and he came back. So just 2 fights on, he was taking on Lennox Lewis. When he could have just waited it out and got a title shot, he wanted to fight, because of his pride, British pride and being territorial, he wanted to fight this 14-0 novice/prospect, Lennox Lewis, for the European title. And Lewis went into the fight knowing that Mason had a detached retina, recently. And Lewis told his team, I'm going to blind him. I'm going to target his eye. I'm going to blind him. This is how vicious Lennox Lewis was, people. This is how vicious boxing is at the highest level. A lot of these guys, these big punchers, they're vicious. I've covered this in other videos before. But this is what Lewis apparently told his team. I'm going to blind him. He went in there with the intention of permanently blinding the man. Using legal punches, obviously, not thumbing him in the eye, but he knew that he'd had a detached retina. So, in the training camp for the Mason fight, Lewis had all his sparring partners have an X, either, I think it was, he had them put tape, all right, an X made of, tape on their headgear near their eye, the same eye that Mason had injured. So Lewis would practice throwing his jab and throwing his punches at the eye of his sparring partners because he wanted to target Mason's damaged eye. And so Lewis ended up winning the fight, and unsurprisingly, Gary Mason's eye was swollen up to a very large size because Lewis had been targeting it. And after the fight, Mason once again had issues with his eye. And I think he briefly retired. He was out of the ring for a good few years after the Lewis fight. Maybe 3-4 years. He did eventually come back and have a couple more fights. I don't think them fights were in the UK. I think they were in America because I think, just from memory, he couldn't get licensed in the UK again because of his eye problems. But he did fight in America a couple times. So, yeah, that decision to face Lennox Lewis rather than go for a title shot effectively ended Gary Mason's career. Just because he was proud and territorial. Dillian Whyte could potentially be making the same mistake if he takes on Joyce. He's very dismissive of Joyce. He says he's got no defense and no power. And many of the fans agree. Joe Joyce looks very clunky, he looks easy to hit, etc. But the proof is in the pudding. I've said this before about Joe Joyce. I don't know how it works in terms of his style, in terms of what he does. I don't know how it works, but it does. You have to look at the results and say, well, it's working for him. He was one of the most highly decorated amateurs Britain has ever produced. Go look at Joe Joyce's resume. This was a highly decorated amateur. In fact, I'll put a screen grab of Joe Joyce's amateur record on screen right now. Well, highlights of his amateur record on screen. So you can see how highly decorated the guy was. And also, he was in the World Series of Boxing. And he fought top level fighters in the World Series of Boxing. I think he had about 16 fights and he only lost 2. And he fought top guys in there and beat top guys. So even though his style looks horrible and amateurish and it looks easy to defeat, it's clearly not. And in terms of Joe Joyce turning professional, look at Joe Joyce's fight against Ian Lewison. That was very early on. That was Joe Joyce's pro debut, wasn't it, against Ian Lewison? And he stopped Ian Lewison in quicker fashion than Dillian Whyte did. And that was in Dillian Whyte's, I don't know, 15th or 16th fight. Joe Joyce did a better job in his first fight. So, if I was advising Dillian Whyte, I don't know how open he is to taking advice, but if I was in his camp and I was advising him, I would quickly dissuade him from taking a Joe Joyce fight. Not like he doesn't have a chance of beating Joyce, but it's just a risk not worth taking. And again, I don't know whether he is thinking about fighting Joyce, whether he's just sounding off. But if he is thinking about it, I would strongly advise him against it. You're on the brink of a world title shot. Why on earth would you be taking on a 4-0 novice? Like, madness. So let me know what you guys think about it in the comment section below. Dillian Whyte with his words for Joe Joyce. Yeah, let me know, people. It's Hatman, I'm out.